All right, in this video, we're going to be going over the small intestine. This is the second video I'm recording in the Young Organs series. So we started with the stomach, we're doing small intestine now, we'll do large intestine, then urinary bladder, then gallbladder, then Sun-Jiao. We're going to start off with the statements of fact. The small intestine governs the separation of the clear from the turbid. Going forward, this is the main thing that the small intestine does. Just like the main thing that the spleen does is that it's in charge of all transformation and transportation, the small intestine is in charge of all separation of the clear from the turbid. We see this show up in a bunch of different ways. On the physical level, this can be something as common as leaky gut syndrome, where you're bringing in things that are not you, that should be kept out. In this case, that would mean the separation of the clear from the turbid has broken down and you're bringing in the turbid as opposed to bringing in the clear. This can exist on the level of the mind. People who have trouble figuring out when confronted with a question which is the right answer and which is the wrong answer, the ability to separate intellectually the clear from the turbid. The separation of the clear from the turbid is something you're going to see again and again. And anytime you're dealing with a patient who seems to have trouble with this aspect of discernment, you're going to be working with their small intestine. An interesting part of this is that very frequently you see people who have this problem at a mental emotional level, manifesting this at a nutritional level as well. The next statement of fact is that the small intestine transforms food and separates the clear from the turbid. Part of what is being said here is that before the clear and turbid are separated, a transformative process has to occur. This isn't simply square goes this way, round goes this way. There's a process of untangling them, and we're calling that transformation. All transformation in the body is ultimately governed by the spleen, but that doesn't mean that other organs aren't participating in some aspects of that. If we're seeing things like undigested food in the stool, we're not thinking small intestine first, we're thinking spleen first, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a small intestine component to that problem. The next statement of fact is that the small intestine governs the thick fluids. The basic thing to know is that the jin are the fluids that are closer to fluids, and the ye are fluids that are closer to oils. There's a viscosity to them. So when we say governs the ye, what we mean here is that it governs the synovial fluids in the joints, and a handful of other ones. But if you're having problems with those fluids, you're going to be looking to the small intestine. It's also the official in charge of receiving plenitude. Materials are transformed and exit here. This is one of these Bob Flawsy ones. I'm not positive what to say about this, except when we talked about the stomach, one of the things that we said is that it's the elder of the 12 channels. This is because without the stomach functioning, we aren't going to produce postnatal qi. The stomach's functionality creates the qi that the other organs use. But the stomach is not the only organ that's playing a role like that. As we go down the chain of the yang organs involved in postnatal qi production, each one is necessary for this process to happen. So for us to be full of qi and blood in a way that's healthy and in a way that we would want, the small intestine has to be functioning as well. It has to be receiving the plenitude of the food that the stomach has rotted and ripened and that the spleen has begun transforming and transporting. The small intestine has to receive that to further separate and absorb. The last statement of fact we're going to be covering today is that the small intestine governs urination. This is one of those somewhat odd ones until you look at the connections that the small intestine has. One would assume that it's the urinary bladder. One could make the argument that the kidneys are governing urination to a certain degree due to them controlling the opening and closing of the lower orifices. However, the small intestine has a connection from heart through small intestine as a yin-yang fire-paired organs, and then to the small intestine through the tai-yang connection. We see this actually as a very useful way of getting pathology out of the heart, most frequently heat or fire. We can drain that through the heart, through the small intestine, and then out through the urine. When looking at digestion overall, food enters the body, goes to the stomach rots and ripens the food, the spleen transforms and transports it. The aspect that is not yet ready for the spleen through the rotting and ripening process goes on to the small intestine, where another separation of clear from turbid occurs. The clear goes to the spleen from the small intestine, where it's transformed and transported again, and the turbid goes down to the large intestine and to the urinary bladder for excretion. So you can think of this in a certain way as a second extraction. The stomach does its job, takes out as much clear as it can. The small intestine does its job, takes out as much clear as it can. The spleen receives both of those and distributes them where needed. We mentioned earlier the connection between the small intestine and the heart through their yin-yang pair. There are a number of ways in which that matters. The first is that the small intestine's ability to separate the clear from the turbid happens at the level of the heart. The small intestine, quote, gives discriminating capacity and critical appraisal of issues to the heart. The heart's ability, our, let's say, overall capacity to discriminate and appraise comes from the small intestine. Moving on to the general small intestine pathology, signs and symptoms. This is our same just overall picture that we do with the stomach, that we've done with the other organs. If we're thinking small intestine, there's not a lot to distinguish it from a lot of other organs. The first thing we're looking for are bowel problems, especially anything having to do with gas or rumbling in the intestines. That indicates that maybe we have a small intestine problem. And then it's any issues of mental clarity, especially related to discrimination. Any way that you can apply the concept of a problem of the separation of the clear from the turbid, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, whatever, we might be looking at a small intestine related pathology. You see this a bit as well in emotional and mood alterations. Because of the small intestine's connection with the heart, if we have a lot of accumulation of pathology within the small intestine, it can begin affecting the heart as well. Of course, diet is going to be an issue here. Small intestine its main job is interacting with food that's passed through the stomach already. So just like the stomach, and just like we'll see with the large intestine, whether food's excessively cold, excessively hot, excessively heavy, we're going to see pathology accumulate in the small intestine. Emotions can affect it, and here we're looking pretty much the same as the spleen and the liver. Sadness is going to be an issue. The deficiency caused by that can create a problem in separating the clear from the turbid in the person's thought process. A person who's dealing with long-term sadness can end up with small intestine qi deficiency. If the small intestine becomes deficient in qi, then the ability to discriminate pure from the turbid goes down. We'll see this manifest in then other thought processes and other emotional aspects. This would be a person who comes to your office who's been grieving for an extended period of time for, say, the loss of a family member. They've gotten digestive problems, trying many different diets, some of which seem quite strange, which would be the inability to separate the clear from the turbid, and then having that go on to affect more and more their ability to properly nourish and support themselves. Worry can cause issues here as well, but what we see here is more of a qi knotting issue. If the qi begins to stagnate within the small intestine, this tends to affect the spleen and stomach more, as it can be a bit of a rumination-related issue. But if it begins to affect the small intestine, then what we tend to see is as worry occurs, the intestines knot and twist. In terms of the basic small intestine patterns, we don't have many to look at this stage. Most of the time, the small intestine is being used in its function as a yang organ to clear things out of other parts of the body. Very often the small intestine and large intestine and urinary bladder have as their main function the excretion of waste. In this case, we've got a couple things to look at in terms of patterns. Full heat in the small intestine is the first one. Here we're going to see heat signs affecting the heart coming from the small intestine. So what we're going to see is mental restlessness, insomnia, an uncomfortable feeling and heat in the chest, literally almost a heartburn-like feeling, though it tends to be deeper, abdominal pain, and thirst with a desire for cold liquids, much like full stomach heat. And here we're going to have scanty dark urine and potentially burning pain and blood in the urine. Now, on a Western anatomical level, there's no way that a problem in the small intestine is going to be affecting the urinary bladder so directly without causing general, let's say, lower jiao issues. But in this case, as mentioned earlier, we have this heart, small intestine, urinary bladder connection through the paired fire organs followed by the paired taiyang organs. So pathology that manifests in the small intestine often ends up in the urinary bladder. We also see this in the small intestine separating the clear from the turbid and sending turbidity to the urinary bladder and to the large intestine. Both of these are vectors for pathology to pass out through the urine, and specifically full heat in the heart or small intestine is a common cause of urinary tract infections. The last pattern we're going to cover is small intestine qi stagnation. This is also known as small intestine qi pain, and we just call this gas pain. It feels like a lower abdominal twisting discomfort. It can extend to the back. It's definitely worse with pressure. It involves some level of abdominal distension, and it's better with passing gas. It's pretty straightforward. It's not a complicated condition. We can treat and prevent this. Some people get this chronically, and it can be decently debilitating. Through acupuncture and herbs, and usually looking at their diet and their emotional state, this is pretty easy to sort out with most people. Small intestine is fairly straightforward at this stage, just looking at it as a zong fu, just looking at it for what it does as an organ. Thanks. See you next time.